How's everybody today? Having a good day? Awesome. I just wanted to say thanks again to Andy, Ben, and Wade for putting together such a great event. They brought me out from Philadelphia, so I'm really happy to be here. I spent the weekend hanging out and enjoying the sights in the city. Really the only thing that makes me more excited than talking about research to a large group of people is getting to talk about research and then dismissing a large group of people to lunch. I think that makes me a pretty popular guy, right? So there's no way I could say no to coming out and doing that. So I'm Victor. I work at EY Intuitive. We are a research design development studio located in Philadelphia. We're under the EY umbrella. They have a number of studios, so we're client-facing. We don't have our own product. We work across industries with a lot of different clients on their products. And like I said, I'm a researcher, but I'm also here today to share with you that I am an experiment. But who isn't, right? More specifically, though, I spent a little bit over a year doing just one specific kind of project that we have at Intuitive, what we call research and strategy projects. You might call them something different, but these are really projects where maybe you don't even have your product identified yet, but your goal is to engage in research and identify what are the needs, what is your product going to become, how are you going to meet those needs. So really, you might call it discovery. It's initiating that process where you're going to go out and you're going to talk to people and you're going to find out things. It's meant to be brief because designers are very impatient, and as a researcher I know that, and they want to get started creating things. And also, if you're getting funding, they're going to want to see something that's being built much sooner than a few months down the road. So you have to have a brief timeline. And it focuses on generative research methods, which are things like interviewing, contextual inquiry, things where you're really getting a lot of data about the what and the why that currently exists, not so much usability testing, which comes later. So if you look at this little graphic of what the design process might look like, the tip of the spear up there is where the research and strategy project is going to be. And then from there, you're going to go into your designing and your building, and then your evaluation is going to be your usability testing, and you're going to be going through that. So I'm talking about that today, that tip of the spear piece. Why do you do that? Well, first, if you're user anything, you actually have to go out and talk to users. So if you're going to say, we're creating a user-centered product, you have to have data where you've actually gone out and identified that there's a need for your product and understand how your users are going to become users of your product, so future users at that point. And then it's also good for generating buy-in. The research you're going to do, the stories you're going to learn from talking to people are going to become the narrative that your team builds together around the product. In the months and years that follow, you're going to say, oh, remember these people we talked to? This is how we're addressing their needs. That becomes the story that your team has cohesively and collaboratively developed together through these research and strategy engagements. But you have to be efficient, or no one will care, and research will get left behind. That's a sad story. But as a researcher, I spend a lot of time sitting around tables with clients who, they understand it, they get it, we should do research, but if it's not going to happen quickly, why should we do it? How are we going to fit it into our tight timeline? And that was the purpose of creating the experiment in which I served on these very specific types of projects for a year. I did 9 different projects during that time, and I was able to learn, taking all these pieces of the puzzle of becoming efficient at doing these projects and turning them into a much more cohesive 4-piece puzzle that actually creates a picture of how you get to efficiency and effectiveness when it comes to doing research and strategy. So, not sponsored by Sesame Street, but the letter P brought us people, process, product, and presentation. Those are the 4 components I'm going to be talking about specifically today around doing a research and strategy project. And I'm going to be using insurance company P, a large insurance company, life insurance specifically, as a little bit of a case study. I'm not going to be too heavy-handed in tying in what we did for them to everything throughout what I learned, but I'm going to use them where I see fit to provide a little bit of a more tangible relationship between what I'm talking about and what we did. And so specifically to insurance company P, they had a problem. They had a portal. We called it a Franken portal because it was the kind of thing where, part of it was from the 90s, and part of it was from the aughts, and then to the 2010s. And depending on what you were doing within that area, you knew where you were at. And they wanted to understand why their customers, who were HR people at other companies, weren't using their portal because they had all the functionality there. You could go there to pay your bills. You could add and take off policyholders, but they had something like 80% of their clients who had enrolled, who had actually created an account to access the portal, but then about 20% who were actually using it. So everybody else was mailing in or forgetting to mail in a check each month. Everybody else was calling in to have a policyholder, which means a new hire, added or taken off. And that was really taxing their resources when they had this other great thing available. So our research and strategy piece was, what are we going to do to address this? What doesn't exist today that's going to help figure out how insurance company P can increase usage of their portal? Now, we'll come back to that more later, but that's a little bit of the story around that I'm going to be using. So let's talk about the people first. I know it's a research and strategy project, but look at this cast of characters. It's not just a researcher. It's pretty much everybody, and it should be. It should be whoever's going to be in charge of the product when it becomes something. It's going to be the designers. It's going to be developers. That's what we call them. You might call them engineers. It's going to be all the key stakeholders that you identify. And you know what? It's getting them at the right place at the right time. And surprisingly enough, through my experience of doing the research and strategy projects, the right time was immediately. So at the beginning, you want to identify up front who you're going to have on these projects. And there's a lot of critical reasons for that. So first of all, it's just creating a level of comfort and a working relationship with people. And maybe it's unique to where I'm coming from, but we didn't always identify, here's the 5 people or the 6 to 10 people who are going to be involved in this project. You know, occasionally people were their bandwidth. They didn't have enough to take on a new project, but we knew in a month they would be available, so we'd pull them in at that time. And what that did, though, is it really made that person feel less engaged, less part of the team. Sure, I can come in with a month or 2 weeks left in a project, and I can design some things that you ask me to and tell me why that's important. But I can do a lot better, and I can feel a lot more invested if I've been there the whole time. So it's that rapport that's critical that you're developing by having everybody attending the meetings from the beginning, understanding what the research is finding from the beginning. And it promotes that shared understanding of the project as well. And another thing that's important, that seems obvious, but really hit home because it happened a few different projects and it caused actual roadblocks to come up during the projects, was we had people who we hadn't projected out their availability because we didn't identify at the beginning they were going to be on the project. Well, you can't tell somebody, well, you can, but it's inhumane to tell somebody you can't take your already booked international vacation because we didn't tell you, but a month ago we were thinking we were going to put you on this project. And then what also happens is you let that person take the vacation, somebody has to emerge and take their place. And that really didn't work too well either. So it was a lesson learned, and maybe it's obvious on its face that you need to understand what everyone's availability the entire duration of the project is going to be. And the best way to do that is to know from the beginning who you're going to be involving on that project. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the process. I have five points to go over here. First of all, being crystal clear from the get-go. Something we do, and I'm guessing that most people do, is we have this big meeting at the beginning. We call it a kickoff, and we talk about what we're going to be doing, who's responsible for what. What we realized was, even waiting until then, when you want to be fast and efficient, is waiting too long. So you don't wait for the kickoff meeting to tell people, hey, I'm going to ask you to be responsible for identifying all the previous research that's been conducted on your project. You don't wait to tell people, you know what, the biggest roadblock to getting a research and strategy project done in a timely way is actually scheduling people to talk to. So if you already come to the kickoff meeting and you know the 10 people from your group that I should be speaking to, and you've already looked at their calendar to try to identify time, that's going to reduce the amount of effort that goes into scheduling those people immensely. So what we actually started doing was having a pre-kickoff call with just a couple of the key players. So who's going to be in charge of recruiting participants? And if it's somebody from the client side, we need to talk to that person to make them aware. You know, when there has been issues around timeline, almost always it's been because we can't get in touch with the right people quick enough. And so you need to start identifying who those are going to be, and you need to come with their schedules so that we can start looking at times to schedule talking to them. And then really just being crystal clear about what the expectations are for the rest of the project is something that you want to do immediately from that kickoff call or from the kickoff meeting onward, and just setting expectations and understanding that if things don't go the way we've set them, we're going to have to change something, and whether that's extending the timeline or reducing the number of people we talk to, that's an expectation you put out there immediately. So keeping your team close. We have a distributed team, and so not everybody is in Philadelphia with me, although I know they wish they could be. Some people are actually out here in Utah. I met with a colleague over the weekend. He lives near Antelope Island. I hadn't heard of it. That was not even a joke. Okay. Antelope Island, yes. Anyway, so what you really want to do, and for this first bullet, I'm talking about the full team. So if you're client-facing, I'm talking about the client. If you're working with a VP from some division that isn't on your team, I'm talking about including them too. And whether it's once a week, twice a week, 5 days a week, you want to check in and show your progress and make sure everybody feels like they know what's going on. And from a researcher perspective, that means being ready and comfortable to talk about, what I've been finding with my research. I can't just do my interviews and sit on it. I have to be thinking about how am I going to process this and talk to other people. You probably haven't heard of it, but recently this tool called Slack came out, and that's something that's been really useful too for just quick communication, and well, I don't need to tell you more about Slack. And then this last bullet is something that came out of the progression of the projects that I did. So we weren't doing it from the beginning, but what we realized was one of the best ways to get everybody to feel like they're a part of things is to just, at some point mid-project, after you've talked to maybe about half the people that you're wanting to talk to, or after you've done whatever you would consider to be a decent amount of research, but not all of it, bring in our case, the client. In your case, if it's somebody internal who's a stakeholder, bring everybody together, have lunch, and then talk about what you've done, do some whiteboarding, and what that really can turn into is language that you can use later on in the project to reflect that you were listening to them. So I'm going to talk about it a little more as we get further into my presentation, but we really found value, and our clients were all over the country, but bringing them in, come out to Philadelphia, come out to our space, see how we do things, and then let's talk about what we're finding, and then using that conversation as part of our final presentation to show how we were listening and reflecting what their understanding of what we were doing was. And then collaborating and don't hand off. So as a researcher, I collect the data, but the expectation shouldn't be that I'm the only one looking at it and understanding it and processing it. And it's because I'm not the one who's going to be using it. In the end, it's going to be my designers, it's going to be my developer colleagues, it's going to be the client who all needs to understand what is it that we're finding. So involve everybody. And when it comes to the tech side, so part of a research and strategy project should also be not just thinking about what are the user's needs and what are they currently doing that we can insert a product to make that better, but what are the tech requirements going to be? What are the tech constraints going to be? And so while I do not have technical expertise on a research and strategy project, we will have one of our developers, a technologist, who is also doing research around, okay, whatever we're going to concept out of this research, what is going to be the technology that it takes to bring that to life? Because that's going to be pretty important to understand in the end, and not just say, here's something that's technically impossible, but it looks really great in wireframes. Being proactive and raising a flag. So I think a lot of us, maybe I'll say all of us, as people who tend to be high-performing individuals, I know the designers, the PMs, the researchers I work with, they like to take on more, and it's never enough. So never let it on that you've taken on too much. Well, that can come back to bite you. It will come back to bite you. And so having brief check-ins, and these are different from the team calls where maybe you're reviewing the design, but more of a 5 to 10 minute, hey, how is everybody doing, where you say, are there any roadblocks you're experiencing personally as far as your bandwidth, as far as the tasks that you're trying to accomplish? Does anybody have availability so they can help you? Those kind of things, for sanity's sake, are really good to make sure that you implement from the beginning in any project, but in the research and strategy projects, because of their pace, it was really important. And then also, it's important to know that if you don't feel right about something, so for me it might be, hey, we've promised this amount of interviews, but we still haven't talked to anybody and it's 2 weeks in, that's something I can't just sit on. I need to make it known. Something has to happen about this. So giving people that setting, that opportunity to be able to raise a red flag is something that's really important. And then thinking about, as a team, okay, how do we go about resolving this? And so hindsight is gold. It was already mentioned, but for each and every one of these projects that I was on, we did a postmortem. That sounds gruesome. So we did a project retrospective, and it can be as simple as saying, okay, here's 3 categories. What worked well? Because we want to honor that. We want to say, hey, good job. This did well. Let's keep up. Let's make sure this stays doing well. And then the other category of what didn't work so well, and being honest about that. What went wrong with this? There's always something that you can improve. And then the third category of, okay, how are we going to improve that? And what I saw, it was really great. The progression was from project 1 through project 9 over the course of this year. The things that were in the what didn't go well column, sure enough, were in the what went well column by the end. We still weren't perfect. We were just thinking of new and harder things to try to master by the end versus, hey, make sure you're not scheduling a project on top of somebody's vacation in the beginning. And so I strongly recommend for any project, the end shouldn't just be here. It should be, now I'm going to force you guys to get back together and talk about how this went and what we can continue doing to make sure that it goes better in the future. All right, so now the actual product. For a research and strategy piece, this is going to be a presentation. It's going to include what the research found. Sorry, I'll go back. You were taking a picture. Also, this will be available on Slack, which is why I have these slides here to sort of use as a checklist, but I'm not reading over them now. So hopefully, if you feel so inclined, you will use it later. So anyway, now I'm ahead of myself. Part of the product is going to be talking about what your findings were and conveying your research. But then we also give design concepts. So here are screens that visualize what this future could be based on what our research found. And then also a technology assessment that says, what is the technology that's going to be required to get there? And then the last piece, which is critical, is a roadmap. Here's how we're going to get there. Here is some concrete steps that if we started building this thing tomorrow, we would start here, and this is the process we would go through. And so what we've learned from the experience that I went through was that a lot of times in your final presentation, you're not going to be just talking to design experts. You're not going to be talking to people with deep technical backgrounds. You're going to be talking to the senior VP of something who just wants to make sure that what he's in charge of is making money, or what she's in charge of is increasing its number of users. And so you need to hook that person, and you have about 3 to 5 slides to do that. And so taking those first 3 to 5 slides and making sure that you're in a concise way, telling your story and grabbing your audience, so that way you can get into what I call the good stuff, other people call it the boring stuff, but all the research that went into what your concepts are going to be. And so here's just an example from the insurance company P slides. And I'll just talk a little bit about each slide because after that I'm going to have the logic that went behind them. So this first slide, we just said, hey, this is what your portal is today, right? There's nothing here that says really anything too profound. This is what your portal does. It's a great location and it has the functionality you need. Then our next slide, stakeholders and policyholders want access. And the word springboard is highlighted. The reason why that term, a springboard, which is not a real thing, but it's an action-oriented dashboard. A springboard is what came out of our meeting that we had in the middle where the client came and we talked about what we were finding and we said, hey, people don't just want, this like dashboard where they can see things. They want a springboard where they can get into things, so immediately launch into tasks. And they loved it. It's not me to judge whether or not that's the greatest term in the world. So we said, let's use it. Let's use the springboard. And they actually were using it. By the time we got to the end of the project, this springboard idea had grown legs of its own. So we reflected to them in this slide. We listened to you. We understand what it is that you are understanding from our research was, and we're going to honor that. And then the famous redacted slide. This is a beautiful conceptual slide that actually contains a post-holiday party picture of all my colleagues from 3 years ago. But what the purpose of this slide in the course of the presentation was it was teasing the design concepts we were going to show later, because that's when senior VP of whatever is hopefully going to say, oh, now I want to stick around because I want to see how they got there. And then talking about these are just, for this example, themes that came out of the research. And so, again, I want to talk a little bit about those slides that I just showed you. That first slide, some people call it the marshmallow because it's fluffy and sweet. But what you're doing there is you're saying, in all likelihood, whether you're working with a client and they have an existing product, or you're working on an internal team and you're trying to think of something new or improving a product, you are probably going to be sitting in a meeting next to somebody who created the thing that you thought was not so good. Instead of telling them how terrible it was right off the bat, which us researchers and designers have a tendency to do, tell them something nice, like, your product deserves to exist, and here, we can make it better. Start it like that. That's the marshmallow slide, right? That starts a conversation. That relieves some of the stress that you might be feeling when you're sitting down as someone who created something and you know it's about to get ripped to shreds. So, hey, that portal, yeah, it was a lot of things, but two things that it was functional and a centralized location. So good job on that. And then I commented on it, but with the springboard concept, we're making this connection back to, we're not just showing up here at X location to deliver you this final presentation, but hey, this was a journey we went on together, and do you remember that point in the journey where we talked about a springboard? Well, that really stuck out to us, and we included that as the language that we're going to use to talk about this idea that we're thinking of now that we've completed our research. And so, hey, thank you for being a part of the process. And that really is something that, if you can find a way to do that, it will generate a lot of buy-in and goodwill, regardless of whether it's a client or somebody from outside of your product team that just came up. And we don't want everybody to be giving you their ideas the whole time and saying that you have to honor every idea, but just thinking about it, how can you show that you were listening? And that's how we did it for that specific case. And not letting tech be an afterthought. This was actually, for me, one of the hardest things to do. So research and strategy, right? I'm focusing on research. Technology means nothing to me, right? But that's really not true, and it's not true in terms of how the project unfolds, where there's a technology expert trying to identify what technology will we need, how are we going to make this concept, how would we bring it to life. But also, as a researcher, I'm talking to people, and I'm creating themes or stories that people are telling me. That doesn't seem, in my mind, to tie in very well to technical requirements. But when you tell a story, if you can tie those together, it sounds a lot more cohesive and a lot more like everyone's on the same page. And so really, this was the hardest thing to get right. And it wasn't until the last time that we felt like, the very last project that I was on, that we felt like we got it right. And that was where our presentation didn't have a completely separate section that said technology, but it was actually woven into the story with the rest of the research. So while I'm saying don't let tech be an afterthought, I also acknowledge that is a hard thing to do in the context of thinking about what is all this great information your users are generating. How do you make it sound coherent side by side with technological requirements? And that's hard. So be thinking about that from the beginning, and also work closely. That's where I also had to develop a relationship. Whoever was going to be in charge of the technology piece, I had to work with them and make sure they understood what I was finding, and they had to make me understand, which I feel very sorry for anyone who has to do that, understand what they were finding so that we could talk the same language when we were creating the presentation. So telling a cohesive story with the fewest slides. I have a colleague who likes 200 slide decks. I don't like that. It requires a long meeting with very little ability to talk about what you did afterwards. I'm more of a 40 or 50 slides at the most, with time to talk about it afterwards. But use research themes, or you can use user stories and workflows. You can talk about goals. Why is it that our product should exist. What goals are out there that people currently have that they're using other things to do, and how are we going to insert ourselves there? So there's not one correct way to tell the story, but like I was saying, if you can weave tech into it as well, then your story is going to sound a lot more cohesive and coherent. And I'll show you an example just from, again, the insurance company P project. We have each theme that we found in the research, and if you recall previously on the slides, we called out 4 major themes. Each theme walked through then this subsequent set of slides that talked about how we got there. And so basically we came up with what we found. So here are the high-level bullet points around what we found going on. I'm not going to give you guys time to read it all, but you can look at it later if you want. And then a slide showing what we heard. So, hey, we talked to real people. They look like that. And then this is what they said. This was their real words. And so that is what informed our findings. Oh, and also, so I don't have it on this slide, but what would be there is a big picture of, their current product, a screenshot, and then talking about, okay, this is what we observed. And so now this is what we recommend. And these recommendations are not meant to be abstract and left here. When you're talking about it, when you're in front of the group of people that you're presenting to, you're saying, okay, these recommendations are now going to become visualized in the concepts that you're going to see later. And that's where it's important for your designer to understand what it is these recommendations mean and to have been working on this project together from the beginning, because they're going to need to speak to how these were addressed, and it's going to have to be pretty clear. So we also came up with sort of an ideal number of concepts as being 5. And that was something that there was a lot of back and forth on. A lot of people, a lot of our designers really want to make a screen for everything and show an entire workflow. But really what we found for the research and strategy project, the piece that's really important was to show a diverse range of states and be able to talk to those as a way of really spurring the conversation. Because what we also found was those concepts, if you concept out every screen of a 30-screen workflow, and at the final deliverable, like, we like the idea, but that is terrible, and so we're gonna go same idea, but a different direction, then you've spent a lot of time thinking about each individual step in this workflow, where you might just have the beginning state and the end state and say, you know what, if we decide that this is the way we want to move forward, that's what we're actually going to spend the rest of our time doing, is defining what this middle state looks like. So don't spend your time creating something that might eventually, I would say, is definitely going to evolve, because the point of the concept isn't coming in and saying, look, I've got the final and only way of thinking about our product. It's saying, here's a picture of what we might be able to do. Let's see if we want to get there or if there's a different way we want to go. In the most appropriate way of telling a story, I have a reputation, I guess, of being a curmudgeon or somebody who, don't tell me you want to use video in your presentation. And the problem I have with that is pretty much based on personal experience. I think there's a place for video. I think there's a lot of good place for video. I just think I'm the wrong person to use video, because there's been too many times where I come to a client site and nothing is set up the way it should be, and then you've got some bells and whistles in your presentation, and instead of playing the video, it plays nothing, and then there's like the one joker in the back who's like, I thought you were a technology company, and you're like, oh, shucks, you win again, joker. And so I try to not put myself in that situation. But I do know that there's a use for video. So, video or audio of interviews that you've done. Animation, I love. I love that my designers use a lot of animation. So whatever you feel works best, though, don't go overboard. Everything doesn't need to be a video. Everything doesn't need to have audio. You can do voiceover and tell people. You can convey your message effectively. Choose your medium. Incorporating other devices, I think that's one of the most exciting opportunities we have, is that, a product might look one way on a desktop or a laptop and another way on a wristwatch. And so, for insurance company P, 99 out of 100 of their customers were going to be sitting in front of a desktop or a laptop, but we still showed them, hey, how might this experience look if somebody then gets an alert that a new policyholder needs to be accepted, and using their smartphone, they can just go in through the portal and accept that. And so that's exciting opportunity for a designer too, to think about, okay, how am I going to take this from one screen size to another, what needs to change. And so making sure that you show that through your concepts so that you reflect that you've been thinking about that as part of the experience, and hopefully you open that door for an opportunity to design around that as well. And then, like I mentioned, ending with a really detailed roadmap. So that's sort of like at the very end, you want to have something that you can hand that says, if you like what we did, or if you're talking, to your own team, if this is the direction we want to go, we've put some real thought around what are the next steps? What do we need to do? So as an example, and I think this is actually supposed to look like a road, but this is the type of roadmap that we handed off with the insurance company project. And if you were able to see it along the top, it breaks it down into 2-week sprints. And then along the side, it talks about who's doing what and who the focus in terms of the user is. But we could take that and say, here is the next 6 months of work if we want to start moving forward. And that's really convenient, and it's something that makes the conversation a lot more impactful than, okay, now we're going to go back and we're going to go think about it. And if we want to move forward, let us know what the next steps are. You have something. You have a map that can then start leading you down to actually creating and building this product. All right, so then the final piece, presenting like a pro. It's fairly straightforward, but there are a wide variety of people who feel comfortable presenting. And ultimately, though, everybody on your team should have the opportunity to talk about the work that they've done. And in a research and strategy project, that would mean me as the researcher, I get to talk about some of the things up front. Designer, technologist, the engagement person is going to talk about how the relationship went. Everybody should have a chance to talk, and everybody should sound like they're on the same page. So practice, right? I actually learned a lot about practicing over the course of my year doing research and strategy projects. A lot about having dry runs. So one of the biggest things I learned is when we would think that we were ready, or when it would be getting close to the final deliverable time, we would set up a dry run with our management team. And we would actually be at various states of readiness when we went into that. So sometimes our concepts wouldn't be 100% finished. Sometimes our decks were still, in the draft mode. We would get slammed each time. It was not a good idea to set up a dry run with management until we were really all on the same page and ready to call it final ourselves. And so making sure that we were doing dry runs internally and getting on the same page just with the team before pulling in our senior management. That was a critical lesson learned. And then just keep on doing practice runs, because there's no such thing as too much practice when it comes to getting up and presenting in front of senior leadership. Because most likely, at the end of this, whether you're a consultant like me or whether you're an in-house product team, you're probably going to be asking somebody to invest in some money so that you can build something. And you want to be able to present that to them in a way that they find it to be effective. How you present is important. There's not a one-size-fits-all style, though. And so finding somebody who maybe you think does a good job presenting and learning from them. I've used the word I way too many times in this presentation for what I'm comfortable with. If I'm presenting as a team, I do my best to say we about everything, give credit where it's due, but it really should be a we thing when you're talking about what the outcome of this project was, or any project. And being conversational, making sure that you feel comfortable enough with the content that you can say, you can go off script, you don't necessarily sound like you're a robot. And all that really comes back to practicing and being comfortable with what you're saying. And then thinking about your presentation a little bit differently from your leave behind. I attempted to do that today with having the little checkbox. So, that's something where I didn't cover that when I was talking. Also, I haven't read verbatim each of the bullet points. My thinking is, though, if somebody comes along later and just reads through that, they will miss a lot of the funny jokes. However, they will still get the point of the presentation. And so if you have a presentation you're giving and maybe not all the clients are going to be there, or that somebody in the room is also going to be scheduling follow-up meetings with other people and talking about your presentation and talking about the concepts, you need to leave them with enough knowledge that they can do that in an effective way. And so that's where you can use things like the presenter's notes and just thinking about what is it that you're going to be able to leave behind to make sure that this can be not given exactly the way you gave it, but retold in a coherent way by somebody who was in the room that day or maybe missed out. All right, we are coming close to the end. So now, did all the pieces come together? How do you know that you did this successfully? So this is something else that, through the course of doing these projects, how did we determine if we were successful? It wasn't just all about, like, were we able to secure a long-term relationship, but it was about some of the nuts and bolts of things. Did we use our resources the right way? Where I'm at, we often are involved in multiple projects at once. So you have to be aware of what amount of time you're spending, because you're not going to be able to take care of all your duties if you're spread too thin. And so were you able to accomplish what you wanted to in the right amount of time and with the right amount of resources? That's pretty easy to measure when you're at the end. The rest of this, though, really should be coming out of your project retrospective. So when you talk about teamwork, did everybody understand their role and feel like they were bought in? That's much more of a softer thing to measure, but it's equally as important. Let's say you're going to start this journey of now building out this product that you've created a roadmap for. You want everybody to feel like they were part of a high-functioning team, and you want them to feel like they want to stay a part of that team. So did they understand their role and feel like they contributed? And then it makes my managing director a lot happier than it makes me, but it still makes me happy that she's happy when she goes to the rest of the team who was not the researcher and asks them what were the themes that came out of this research, and they're able to recite that. That's something that shows everybody was on board. Everybody played a role in taking a look at the data and determining how are we going to make sense of this. And so being able to articulate that was one way that she was measuring the success of these projects. And then relationship strategy. Modify this to fit your exact situation, but have you expanded your relationship? Maybe it's with a client, or maybe it's with other departments, maybe it's with a senior VP who can now be the champion of this product and find funding for you. Did you provide a vision that's aspirational and potentially months and years of further work if you're going to roll straight from doing the research into building out the product? And then, did you have a clear scope and balance the short-term, I hate how it does it in the middle, but the short-term and the long-term thinking, so that you understand, okay, what can we get into tomorrow, and then what are we going to maybe, and this will come from the technology piece too, what do we maybe have to wait a while until the situation's right for us to get our product at? And so that should all come out of, at the end of your project, doing your retrospective and determining whether or not everybody was able to meet the different targeted outline bullets here. So with that, I have good news for you, almost. So you would think this is the dismissal for lunch slide. It's not. I think there's going to be a more official dismissal. But one other thing. So I wrote a book, and this is shameless self-promotion, but I think I'm allowed to do it. I wrote a book. It has nothing to do with research and strategy projects. It's about applying psychology to design. But my point here is that Front was so gracious that they purchased a few copies of it, and they're going to be giving them out to a few lucky people. And we decided, in order to potentially be one of those lucky people, what you would need to do is leave a comment on the Slack channel that's about this presentation. I give you permission to call me very funny on Slack. If you do that, you increase your chances of winning a book tenfold. But so now with that, I think that Wade or somebody might be coming out to talk about lunch logistics.